this episode. It's going to be a short conversation, but I figured since I talked about this game as I was halfway through it and had a lot of thoughts, most of which remain the same, I should at the very least revisit it. Now that I've completed the thing, I put 92 hours into the game, which I wasn't planning on doing. I nearly platinumed the game, which I wasn't planning on doing, and I've never platinumed a video game before, just not really how I play them. But I ended up really drinking in the experience, and I wanted to say a couple of things about the game specifically and particularly, but then have a little bit of a larger conversation about what I think it says about how we evaluate video games and art in general. You know, I always love getting into that and applying this more to the MCU, the DCEU, video games in general. So I'd really like to have that conversation. Let me begin, though, by saying that I absolutely adored this game. I mean, obviously, right? I was just saying, I put 92 hours into it, nearly did everything that there is to do in the game. I was entertained by all of it. I laughed my ass off throughout, and there were several times where I got emotional. I never ended up, fully breaking down like I do sometimes with some stuff, as I have in things like, say Horizon or Final Fantasy games or games that really, really emotionally get to me. I think the conclusion of Yakuza was kind of maybe hoping it was aiming for that, and I don't want to get into spoilers because I think most people listening to this probably haven't played it. I can talk to the one or two of you who have in the Discord and explain why it didn't fully get me. I was very emotional. It was a very emotional ending, and I was there for it, and I thought it was very, very, very well done, well executed, very satisfying story, beginning, middle, and end. There were a few reasons why some of the beats missed just a little bit with me, but it's nitpicky. And what I wanted to say about the game in general, and I'll give a few examples of this, but it'll really transition us, like I said, it's going to be a short one, very quickly into the larger conversation, is that maybe more than any other game, certainly that I've played in recent memory and that I can recall, this is one of those greater than the sum of its parts experiences, right? I'm not sure that there's any category that I can think of that we typically evaluate video games on and say 10 out of 10. Right, which is interesting. If we're saying gameplay, a lot of the systems, a lot of the ideas presented are extraordinary, are genius. Like I said, I loved playing every element of it, but there are certain things where I feel like the difficulty curve could have been much better. I feel like some of the strategic elements introduced in the battle and in several of the side stories and mini games could have been quite a bit deeper. Like they laid an extraordinary groundwork for something, but then it didn't quite go to the extent that I feel like it just very easily could have. It's not even, that I needed them to create another thing. It's just like do a little bit more of what you were already doing. The graphics aren't going to absolutely blow your mind, especially by a modern standard, but they're pretty good, right? Things like that. The music, there's a lot of great music, but there's also a lot of repetitive music. It doesn't have the kind of huge and diverse and expansive soundtrack and you wouldn't necessarily expect it to, right? That a game like Final Fantasies might have, or there are plenty of others that have more expansive soundtracks. But what's there in Yakuza, especially when the music gets really good, it is kind of S-tier stuff, right? But again, in all of these different categories, I would probably give it 8s and 9s rather than 10 out of 10s if I was the kind of evaluator who did it in that way. But this game is a perfect example of why I don't really think about art that way anymore. I used to, especially when I was in high school and college, and IGN and GameSpot were really the foundational ways for how we, evaluate this stuff. But for example, one category that I could think of to give this game an absolute 10 out of 10 is in characters. Right? Now, that might be something that more often than not in JRPGs or RPGs, we might have that category. How would you rate the game in story, characters, lore? We might care a little bit more about that than, say, other genres would. But characters, Yakuza absolutely gets 10 out of 10, 12 out of 10. Like, so many memorable characters, so many lovable characters. I would say even better than a lot of games that I've played in the more massive RPG genre. Again, I'll just keep bringing it back to Final Fantasy. There are several of those where the side cast, whether it's we're talking about playable characters or just kind of a lot of the people that you meet throughout the journey, can become forgettable by the end. I've critiqued, and we're about to go into Final Fantasy VIII, so I'll be curious to see if I change my tune on this. But that's one of my big critiques of Final Fantasy VIII, is that as much as I love the story, I think there are a lot of forgettable kind of people in the world. Whereas Yakuza, it's just like, I'm going to remember these characters forever, right? All the playable characters, but plenty of the people who you just meet throughout the story who impact the story. I'm talking about people who own bars in the neighborhood, people who run brothels, maybe, someone who gave you a place to stay at the beginning of the game, people who helped you out of a hard time. Some of the alliances that you make along the way. Plenty of the enemies. Well, and another thing, and this is maybe a little bit spoilery, but I'll say it as broadly as I can, that Yakuza does that I've seen very few games certainly do, and very little art, is there were villains to be sure, but it really went out of its way to help you understand everybody's motivations, and it really doesn't present anybody as purely evil, right? Anytime you start to think, oh yeah, this person's purely evil, we should just kill him or whatever, then you learn a little bit more about him, and you go, oh man, maybe corporal punishment, capital punishment, vigilante capital punishment isn't the best of ideas at this particular juncture. And it's really fascinating the way it manages to make you end up caring about characters you thought you were going to hate, end up hating some characters you thought you were going to love about, but also presenting it all as this kind of big, muddy, complicated, gray tapestry of interesting people interlocked in circumstances beyond their control. And it's really a wonderful story in that way. Like I said, with some of the plotting and pacing elements, I had some issues. With some of the themes, I think fell just a little bit short for me, but some of them absolutely flew. Some things that other games and stories just aren't even interested in talking about why we should treat homeless people and sex workers as human beings, right? It's just like, you're not going to find that in Mario, right? It's not going to be a part of Call of Duty, and nor should it probably be. It would feel out of place. But I think for me, and this is the sort of final point that I want to make here, Yakuza, while no category other than, like I said, maybe characters, would I give it a 10 out of 10. There's some issues with the writing. It's an 8 or a 9 out of 10. Graphics, 8 or 9. Gameplay, 9. Replayability. Again, I'll give it a 9 at a lot of stuff that's really, really great, but some of the things are a bit of a grind. Some of the side games I had absolutely no interest in. And some of them where you have to understand Mahjong. And I was like, apparently I don't. I thought I did, and I do not. And I could have learned, but again, how much time are you going to put into stuff like that? But for me, and I think I said this a little bit in my first review of it, but it bears repeating, and now it bears applying to a bunch of other stuff. So I'm going to use Yakuza as the launching off point, but people have really got to stop saying that nobody's got any new ideas. I mean, it really is getting to the point where that critique is, in addition to beyond frustrating, patently absurd, right? Yakuza is overflowing with original ideas. And it's interesting because, as I was just talking about, we tend not to allow for that in our evaluations of things. We put everything into these boxes and categories. Rate it 1 out of 10 in sound, graphics, gameplay, replayability. You can get, even more particular. Like I said, you can add things like story, lore, writing, characters if you want. But still, that's all incredibly limiting, isn't it? Because not every game is going to have the same objectives. Not every movie, not every television show is going to have the same goals in mind. There were some ways in which Yakuza clearly didn't care about brevity in its writing. It goes on and on and on, and that didn't always vibe for me. But it did care, like I said, about showcasing a realistic problem of living homeless for a chapter or two, of dealing with the police as the enemy, as an antagonist of politics, of like needing to raise campaign funds and get involved in local politics, because that is a source of power in our real world. And it's amazing to me how many games want to talk about power, how many stories are very interested in this idea of power, who has it, who doesn't, who wields it over others, and how. But they're so scared to get, quote, political with it. And Yakuza, Yakuza isn't scared of anything. Yakuza wasn't scared to depict a damn thing. And in that way, it was bold, it was fresh, it was creative, it was new, it was different. And I submit to you that people who believe that, everything is a remake or a rehash, or that there are no new ideas and everything is painted with the same broad brush right now, simply aren't putting in the time or the effort or the work to discover gems like this. And I think they're all throughout, cinema, television, video games, comic books. And those are just the things that I know. In music, I hear it all the time in music. It's tempting to think that everything that you hear on the radio, if you only listen to top 40 radio, you're going to hear the same 40 songs over and over and over again. And they're all going to kind of start to bleed together, because what's popular in any given 5 to 10 year span in music there tend to be trends, right? Same with gaming, same with film, same with television. There tend to be these trends, and when something is popular, other people are going to try to recreate it in a certain way, because they're all trying to make money, which is, of course, another part of this conversation that we've had before, and I always kind of laugh at. The actor who played Theoden coming out and saying, Rings of Power is just a money-making venture. I distinctly recall paying for my tickets to see the Peter Jackson trilogy. Y'all weren't giving that away for free. It was not a charity service. I believe you got paid for your time on set, good sir. What are we talking about here? Of course it's a money-making venture. All of it's a money-making venture. And guess what? Going back to my brother and I's conversation, that was a weird grammar. My brother and I talking to Austin Lee Matthews about his show Megaton Girl. Which, by the way, everyone go out and download. But if people don't download it, if people don't support it, if people don't watch it, it doesn't make any money. He can't sell it to advertisers. And if he can't sell it to advertisers to make any money, then he can't pay voice actors to do the show. If you want professionals making quality art, you got to pay for it. And sometimes, and this is what's wild to me, we live in this world where even when it's free, people won't pay for it, or won't get it. Again, you can go and download Megaton Girl totally for free and support it that way, and give it a 5-star or 10-star, whatever review. Don't give it a 5-star if it's out of 10, please. Same with, a lot of our stuff. Some of my stuff is behind paywalls on Patreon or whatever. I'll make this one free because I'm making a ranting point right now. It only seems reasonable. But, there's plenty of stuff that's totally free. The YouTube channel, for example, right? The Everything is Final Fantasy YouTube channel. Totally free. But still, we've got 9,000 Twitter followers, but 344 YouTube subscribers. It's difficult to get people to subscribe to things, even when they're free. And then on the flip side of it, people get upset when things are cash grabs, or when people make safe art. And look, I used to be one of these folks. This is a whole other conversation I want to do sometime in the future, about my transition from being very cynical about safe corporate art to recognizing that that's just a part of the game. It always has been. It's always going to be. And getting mad at any one project, whether that was me in college being pissy about Taylor Swift and Katy Perry all the time, or people now about Rings of Power, or the MCU, or video games, saying, well, the industry is all going in this direction and everything is the same and everything is the same. And it's like, play Yakuza. That's not the same. And I could go through a whole bunch of others. I just started Triangle Strategy recently, and I'll be coming in with my early impressions on that before too long. Same thing, right? Like, yes, this feels very similar to a lot of older games that haven't been around in a while, but it's also very much got its own thing going. So if you're tired of whatever, the AAA open world, story-driven, 100-hour adventure game, if like you're just burnt out on that, There are so many indie games and or even something like this. And I think we do a disservice to the conversation when we bemoan, and again, I've been this person, so I'm not just, throwing this at other people here. When we bemoan what's safe, people doing what they know is going to work, which is less creative, I think it does a disservice to the conversation if at the very least we aren't also making the effort to go out and find the things that are worth building up. And anymore, I'd rather just do the latter and forget about the former. If something is super popular and it's not for me, then let it bring those other people joy, as long as it's not hurting anybody, as long as it's not legitimately destructive, whatever. I don't care if it's brain dead or corporate or whatever. If it's not hurting anybody, let people enjoy their thing. What I think, though, that those of us who do care about creativity in the arts and moving things forward or showing people a different perspective have to be able to look at a game like Yakuza and get past the lack of state-of-the-art graphics and the fact that you could probably cut about 10 to 15% of the dialogue in the game and lose nothing. It has its issues. It absolutely does. And so I'm sure that, on a lot of the review sites, it got a bunch of 8s and 9s, probably no 10s. And there's probably not anybody out there that from a journalistic review standpoint considers Yakuza a masterpiece. But I'm here to tell you that it absolutely is. While it may not be a 10 out of 10 in any particular category, it is a 10 out of 10 experience, especially if you're looking for something that isn't afraid to talk about and deal with and live inside of some pretty uncomfortable topics, and not just give you a clear cut and then the good guy kills the bad guy in the end and peace was restored to the kingdom. I love that stuff too. I'm all for that kind of thing. And I wouldn't even say that Yakuza does so it's going to subvert it and just be a terrible, horrible, make you feel awful ending. And it's not that either. In so many ways, this game, what it does is it regularly walks up to the cliche point, right where you think it's going to do the thing that either Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or maybe even a Final Fantasy would. Though I think Final Fantasy does a good job of this too, zigging where you think it's going to zag. But Yakuza zigs and zags and then walks backward and then jumps forward when you think it's going to, and it's an amazing experience. And I think, again, another reminder that there are so many fantastic pieces of unique art out there. It's really up to the user to find them. Which is why I'm not sure I'll ever understand the people who will make hour-long YouTube videos about stuff that they hate. Watch every single episode of She-Hulk and just create hate content on it. Like, man, there's so much stuff out there in the world. If you pine for something else, go find it and celebrate that. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Celebrate that these folks that make these Yakuza games. I'm a convert. I am a convert. I'd never played one before. I'm looking forward to playing more in the series. Thanks to everybody in the Discord, especially Andy, who I know is big proselytizer of these games as well. And I'm planning on joining you. This was a phenomenal experience. It's an S-tier Final Fantasy game, is Yakuza Like a Dragon. And I highly recommend to everyone who either enjoys JRPGs or is just looking for something different. This is a good place to go. All right, thank you all for listening in. I hope you will continue to be absolutely awesome out there. You know that I will continue to be absolutely Drew Creasman in here. And until next time, I will see you out there in the world.